Welcome to Certain Point of View's Another Pass podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Just go to certainpov.com.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to Another Pass podcast. I'm Case Aiken, and today we are talking about Captain America Civil War. I am joined by my friend Tom Obrzut. Did I pronounce that right? No. You Polish names. Every guy who has a Polish name has always been like, no, that's close enough, but you're totally wrong.
I'd say it would help if you practice, but my wife still can't say it right, so I guess we forgive you this.
That's fair enough. So Tom, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Tom. I'm here to make my very, very first podcast about Captain America Civil War. And I'll start by saying that even though I've enjoyed every single Avenger, Iron Man, Batman, Superman, etc. movie, cartoon that I could get my hands on, I have not read a single comic book in my life. So I'm not providing that perspective.
Well, no, that's fair enough. I think the problem sometimes with these movies is that the fans will go in and know too much. I think there's a couple characters in particular in this movie that rely a lot on the fans knowing who they are and what the broader implications are. So I walked away from the movie when I first saw it really liking it.
Which is interesting because I, having watched all the back movies before, came out with the exact opposite perspective. I actually really did not like it the very first time I saw it. And it was only the second time, because we have just finished watching it, that I feel like on my second viewing I liked it a lot more than on my first viewing.
Gotcha. All right, so yeah, let's get into it. So, pros and cons of the movie. I've actually done a whole podcast over at Certain Point of View talking about things I loved about the movie. We did a late night reaction right after watching it. Let's give it to you. What are your thoughts?
When you first watch it, it's very, very, very hard to follow. It really is. Even I have seen, like I said, all the background movies. I had a hard time actually following certain plot twists, and I had a hard time keeping track of all the copious characters that they had in.
There are a lot of characters in this movie.
There's a lot of characters in this movie, and I don't feel like you need to make a backstory on Tony Stark, obviously. You don't have to make a backstory about Captain America, but when you throw in 17 other characters, somebody who doesn't have necessary perspective is going to get lost really, really quickly.
Yeah, I could see that. The comparison I was making a lot was to the first Avengers movie and the second Avengers movie. The first Avengers movie did a really good job of introducing all those characters if you had never seen any Marvel movie before, or if you'd only seen one. If you'd only seen the Iron Man movies, they did a pretty good job of setting up every other major character in that movie. But then you get to Avengers 2, and they just sort of start with the team together, and they do character establishing bits, but then the movie is just a go. We've established that they're who they are really quickly. We introduce some new characters, but the characters that we have are the team, and right. It's expected that you know who they are. And this movie kind of goes the same way.
But I would argue that the difference is that in Avengers 2 between Avengers 1, having seen both of them, you didn't start off with a completely new team. You had your team from Avengers 1. It sort of continued onwards to Avengers 2 with a few modifications here and there, and you introduce some new villains and a new plot.
But when you go here, you start the movie with the team that they have at the end of Avengers 2.
Yes, you do. But then, all of a sudden, everything starts shifting, where all of a sudden you introduce a host of new characters. You introduce almost no backstory to any of them, and you're kind of left, I think it's very, very telling that I didn't really start understanding this movie until after the first time I saw it. You actually explained to me the backstory on several of the characters.
The one in particular, which people who are not familiar with the comics will have the hardest time with, is the Black Panther.
Yes. Yes.
And that definitely comes into some of my notes on how this movie could have been stronger.
Well, so I think this is a good plug into getting into that. So let's start with the very beginning of the movie. I honestly thought that the beginning of the movie, that first scene, is a very, very nice bridge between Winter Soldier and the current Avengers movie. Because you have
We've got Rumlow, who is Crossbones. He was he was hinted, or he was a reference to a supervillain from Marvel Comics in Winter Soldier, and in this movie, he full on has become that supervillain character.
Yes.
I dug his look. I thought he had a very nice, fully supervillain kind of aesthetic to him. Like in the comic, he just wears like a black tank top with like the crossbone symbol and like a luchador mask with like a skull face. But the look that they gave him in this, I thought worked really well. They gave us a compelling reason for him to be a threat physically to Captain America, even though this Captain America can just kick a car and knock people on the other side of it over, or like fling people across buildings.
Absolutely, and I thought the action was well shot. I thought actually even the angles of the way they shot it was very compelling. And I mean, let's face it, when you go to see one of these Avengers action flicks, you're looking to see some good action.
And they do cool stuff with it. Like they use Scarlet Witch in a cool way to like bring the gas out of the building. They're like, oh, this is why we have these superpowered beings that are less conventional. Like why? Like what is their use in a fight? You know, beyond just being like, all right, well, I'm gonna knock out the bad guy. Like, yes. Oh, it's like, okay, I can suck this stuff out. I can prevent casualties this way. I can do, you know, all these like support things. And she's also pretty terrifying on top of that. But
yes, and I even like the way that she blocked that explosion from Captain America, which would have killed him, and instead tried to redirect it, but didn't do it in the right way, and so it took out part of the building, which created casualties that she felt upset about.
Yeah, I always felt that the damage from that explosion should have been more severe. It felt like if it had gone off on the first floor, all those people in the market would have died. And by going up, it probably only killed like a handful of people relative to the amount that would have been on the first floor. And I really wish it had like caused the building to collapse or something like that, where it's like much worse.
I was expecting a little bit more. I was expecting like a partial building collapse, or even better still, had she just redirected it. I mean, it was nice that the building caught on fire, but had she just lost control of it, maybe? Like, yeah. Redirected it from Captain America so he survives, but half the market dies in a magnificent explosion. That actually might have been.
Yeah. What if it was like a funnel or like a you know, like with a flashlight with like a reflector.
Yeah.
So it burst through one direction, and as a result, all of it went to one thing, and was much more destructive in that one direction than it would have been otherwise.
And I think that would have been, and if anything, you know, she would have felt more guilty because she had redirected the explosion away that killed innocent civilians.
Yeah.
More directly, as opposed to cause structural damage to a building. But you never actually see anybody dying in that explosion. You just see a building that's caught on.
Yeah, and that was part of the problem. Later, when they go through the footage of different incidents with Avengers that were big public, you know, escapades, they show like New York, and then they show DC, and they show Sokovia, and there are these huge set pieces, and they do a really good job of moving the camera angle from being the hero's angle that we saw in those movies to being like men on the streets. And that was really cool because like the trailers didn't do that. They showed footage from the actual movies, and this is like, oh, it's a person looking up at the Hulk, dropping like debris and like killing that person, and presumably. But then they cut to this incident in Nigeria, and it's like a fire. It's just not as like compelling a reason as anything that has come before at this point.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at Avengers: Age of Ultron, and you see how much just raw destruction, like lifting up the better part of the city into the air and then free falling it with countless casualties. You know, she didn't. I mean, her brother died, but she didn't get upset. And now, because she caused a tenth of a building to catch on fire, all of a sudden she's really, really upset.
Yeah,
it is a little bit suspect.
I feel like we're missing some sort of play there.
Yes. But nonetheless, I mean, I'll give the opening sequence good marks because I thought the overall action, which is why we're seeing the movie, was very, very good. And I'll cut to the first introduction of Zemo, the villain. And I have to say, another good point about this movie, I thought that opening sequence where he cons his way into that other Russian agent's door.
Yeah, that was a nice touch, like him like jumping the curb to hit it to give a convincing reason.
Yes.
To like have the guy let his guard down. That was pretty good.
Yeah, he's like, no, I don't want any cops. I'll let you in, and then just knocks him out, and then ties him up upside down to a water sink and starts pouring out the water faucet. I mean, that's like what waterboarding 2.0.
Yeah, it was a very good introduction for the character. I'm a little torn about his ultimate portrayal because I love Baron Zemo in the comics. I think he's one of the best conflicted villains or in some lights, a hero that Marvel has put out in a long time. Like the backstory for people who aren't aware, there have been 2 Baron Zemos. The father was a Nazi in the 40s who was a villain of Captain America's and started like the Masters of Evil in the 60s and was like a very classic Red Skull when you don't have Red Skull, like the dime store Red Skull. And then they had his son come back after he was killed for a while. And at first he was a straightforward villain, not that successful even. And he had one really awesome mission where he got together a group of supervillains that was about 3 times larger than the Avengers. They stormed Avengers Mansion. They beat up their butler. They put Hercules in a coma. They knocked out Captain America, and when he came to, he was chained up. And Baron Zemo had taken all of Captain America's personal effects and slowly, piece by piece, destroyed them, including the last photo Captain America had of his mother. And then he just sort of kept on popping up in comics after that. Did a really cool story where he like pretended to be a superhero with a bunch of other supervillains, and then were revealed to be not as such, but it was a really well-written story, because at first we actually thought it was just a new team of superheroes. And then eventually he got superpowers and became enlightened and realized that there were better ways to do things. And then he hasn't really been seen for a while because it got lost in time. But for a stretch, he actually went through and like he was fixing these huge metaphysical problems because he was in like the higher than Superman power set group. Where like, and upon becoming that powerful, he was like, oh shit, I had really screwed up. I could have done way better with my brains.
We have an editing process, right? We can edit all that out?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I don't know if we will.
Fantastic. Well, I don't know.
No, but I love the character, and I love that.
I like
now,
the character,
I was conflicted because this is not the character we get in the movie.
And this is, again, brings me back to, you know, I haven't read any of those comics. I was not familiar with any of that scene. And I actually like the introduction of this character. And I take him for what he is in the movie, not what he's supposed to be in the comics. And that, I think, is the difficulty with these movies. You're either going at it as, I want to stay true to all the canon of the comics, or I want to create a movie for your average guy who maybe has seen some, maybe not even all of these.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I'm saying I'm a little conflicted, because I thought this was fine, but he wasn't as grandiose as he could be. Like, I don't need fidelity. I need, if you're going to deviate in a big way, I would like it to be relevant to the story or really good. And I thought the background for him was really good. I just think that I have a lot of questions about his plan.
Okay.
And I would have liked to see a little bit more of that. I don't feel that he was as active an agent as he could have been.
Yeah, that's fair. I feel that...
And I think I can get more into my notes on that, but he's a good character in this, but he could have been great.
He could have been great.
He could have been great, and there's a little bit of the Dark Knight Joker syndrome, where it's like, this was all part of my master plan, but we don't see how that makes sense.
That is true. That is true. But nonetheless, we've got the good introduction of him.
So here's the thing that I thought was weird.
Okay.
They don't talk about Hydra at all. Like, they mention it for the Winter Soldier stuff.
Yes.
But they don't talk about how Hydra had infiltrated and taken over S.H.I.E.L.D. and presumably a good chunk of the United States and possibly other governments.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like they went from, if you look at Winter Soldier, where essentially their little floating aircraft carriers crash into DC, which they cut to as one of their justifications.
Yeah, they reference it a lot, but they don't actually talk about Hydra taking over everything.
Right. So you got to keep in mind it's a movie, they can't address everything, but it's sort of, they're using this as a justification for why they're making this big UN scene to rein in the Avengers. Whereas on the other side, they're also praising the Avengers for saving us from Hydra, but they don't really ever fully reconcile it.
Yeah, I feel like that's actually one of my big questions, which is that I feel like the events of Winter Soldier are the exact reason why the Accords don't make sense in this universe.
Yes.
Like the concept that, oh, we're gonna be okay with our government's running all our superhumans is exactly where they were to begin with. Because at the beginning of Winter Soldier, Cap was just an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.
That's right.
And just going off and doing missions. And then he finds out that, oh no, he's actually been working for secret Nazis.
Yes. And in fact, we're going to have this government oversight, which is going to enforce some sort of world order on everything, from these aircraft carrier gunships that are now floating around the world. But then that ends up being an agent of Hydra. a ploy of them to take over the world. But now that we've taken that down, all these ships crash, we have a scene where the Avengers are doing their thing, but no, that's not good. Now we have to put them again in a box.
Yeah, they make passing references, but it seems like, wait, hold on. We know very clearly that regimes change. They talk about that as a possibility, but we have a very concrete example. And it's really weird that we don't talk about the impact that Hydra had on like government control over these like metahuman assets.
Right, and Samuel L. Jackson's. I mean, they brought in every other actor they could find from any movie remotely related to Marvel, but they don't bring in Samuel L. Jackson's character. Period.
Right, well...
The only one that doesn't appear in any of this.
Yeah, he had no part of this little conversation.
Which you would think that, which is another criticism, if you're taking the Avengers and you're trying to put them into a box, would you not think that he would have something to say about that?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think, if this movie had come before Winter Soldier, that would actually be a really logical setup if Captain America was cool with it. Like, if he was the one who was, like, pro, like, Accords, signs up for it, and then at the end of the movie, he's working for the government, and then we find out that Hydra's controlling everything.
Yes.
Because, like Gary Shandling's character in Iron Man and then in Winter Soldier, I forget the senator's name, but he's the one in Iron Man 2 who's trying to, like, have Tony Stark come and, like, have the Iron Man armor just work for the government.
Right.
Which is exactly the scenario. And then we find out that he's actually a Hydra agent. Right. And so the implication of Winter Soldier was that, Hydra was just trying to make it so the U.S. government had complete control over all these superpowered assets. And then this movie is Iron Man being like, no, we should let the government have complete control.
Which I feel is like the complete opposite of his character in general.
I mean, I could see it as being like a sign of growth, but there is generally at least what I've seen, a fan sentiment that the motivation that he had in Iron Man 3 and then in Avengers 2 is the justification for him in this movie. That he saw that Earth is so vulnerable to like outer space threats, and that he doesn't want the Avengers to be split up because that is the natural defense from those outer space threats that are coming.
But isn't that like...
But he never says it.
Exactly. Isn't that reading between the lines? Isn't that something that
Yeah.
you're actually inferring based on your perception of watching all these movies, reading all these comic books, whereas the movie never actually addresses where he actually comes from? So another one of my criticism was, all of a sudden you go from a very big action scene, then you go into a somewhat sappy recreation of one of Tony Stark's initial traumatic memories, which I get sets up the backstory.
See, I like that scene.
I thought they could have maybe looked at the dialogue a little bit more. But anyways, that's fine. I'm okay with it. I can live with it. But then you go from that scene into Tony Stark all of a sudden being this big proponent of this plan to box, sort of the Avengers into signing this accord. And I feel like it was sort of, even just not even reading the comic books, but just watching the movies, you see this guy who's always been rogue, anti-government, his entire movie canon moving into, we should sign this accord. We got to sign this accord.
Yeah, it does seem like a weird shift. Yeah.
But, he does do it. He makes the shift. He starts trying to get all the Avengers into his little signing the accord, create unity for whatever reason.
Yeah, and he teams up with Secretary Ross. And I liked that they brought back William Hurt as Thunderbolt Ross. Like, he was the general who was chasing after the Incredible Hulk in the Ed Norton Incredible Hulk movie.
I missed that one.
Yeah, no, so he's a recurring character. At the time, he was just a general. That's why they reference him having Medal of Honor. He's a major character in Marvel Comics, or at least in the Hulk mythos. So him being the face of this, that was nice continuity, like tying the universe together.
Yet another one of those plot points that actually went over my head because I missed that part.
But weird point, what a waste of Martin Freeman to come in and basically play like the same type of character, but like an underling version of him, but with the same last name. So they kept on being like Secretary Ross, Everett Ross, Secretary Ross, Everett Ross. Like,
absolutely.
Like, all of the scenes that Martin Freeman was in could have just been William Hurt playing Secretary Ross with maybe like a few changes in like the power dynamic, but not like major shifts in the scene.
Well, but would you have actually made any changes? So far, we've gone through the initial action scene, which we both liked, with
Yeah.
maybe a few minor tweak edits. Maybe blow up the entire building otherwise. We cut scene to a recreation of Tony Stark's initial memory of his parents dying in order to grant money to a lot of MIT think tank kids.
Yeah, well, I like that because
Which I thought was-
we see Tony Stark being more than just a hero. Or rather, being a hero for the real world. Like
Yes.
he's not just Iron Man. He's Tony Stark who can be behind a lot of like cool technology and then like fund research and like push forward big ideas to change the world. Like that's the broader Tony Stark.
Which I thought was actually a fine use of his character and such. Then we cut to where he meets with all the Avengers after their mishap, shall we say, in Africa, in was it Nigeria?
Nigeria, I think is what they said.
It was Nigeria, where they create a lot of havoc and kill a supervillain. And at that point, Tony Stark is trying to get them to sign the Accords to limit themselves. Would you have changed anything up to this point in the movie?
Yes. I mean, if we... Yeah, I would have actually had more information about the Accords, and I would have had Tony Stark be a player in it. We have this scene that echoes the comics where like a woman comes up and is like, "You killed my son."
Yes.
That whole bit.
That's right after
And
the
that's
MIT.
showing him having this this face-to-face confrontation with the repercussions of his actions. I would have liked if that was the jumping off point for him to have that conversation with Secretary Ross, with T'Chaka, with all the different nations who are talking about the Sokovia Accords, and have him be sort of the face of the Avengers, because he's the guy who pays for everything and makes everything run.
Yes.
Where he's negotiating the whole thing, so that when he shows up with the Secretary of State, we understand why he's there and that he had a part of it.
So so it's too much of a leap for you to go from one little scene where somebody takes him after a little presentation that he makes to MIT students and say, "You killed my son in the last Age of Ultron movie. You are to blame, and you get to go home, and I live with my grief." It's too much a leap to go from that to putting the Avengers in a box for you.
I don't think it's too much of a leap, but I think that it is one where I would have appreciated, even if it wasn't him fully forming the Accords, but having that conversation with Ross or with someone. Setting up a little bit of the dialogue before it's brought forth to everyone else.
Right.
Because you see that moment, and then Ross shows up. The fact that they came together is part of it. Like, if he had just been there, dealing with his own like mental thoughts of like, well, I'm responsible for this kid dying, and then like Ross comes forward and like, well, a lot of people died. Here's the thing that we have to do, and then he agreed with him. I think that would have been also a viable scene. But the fact that they came together makes me feel that he was already briefed on everything, and I would have liked to see either him being briefed on it and his feedback separately, or him participating in the initial conversations about it.
Yes.
If he felt like more of a hand in forming those Accords, then it's not just him being like the public speaker trying to keep everything together, but him actually being an active participant, which right now he's not enough of one in that element of this plot.
Well, do you feel that actually brings up the issue of, the title of the movie is, Captain America Civil War, right?
Yes.
It's not the Avengers Civil War.
Right. It's definitely focused around Captain America.
So do you think that, I agree with your criticism that taking, if they do the cutscene where Tony Stark has his MIT moment, meets the woman, has a change of heart, realizes there's consequences to his actions, therefore wants to put a box on the Avengers, you're arguing put a middle scene where he actually has an input on the UN impetus.
Yes. Because ultimately he plays the role of the antagonist.
Sure. But does that make it more of now, instead of calling the title Captain America Civil War, does that mean now we should call it the Avengers Civil War?
No, because the Captain America is our viewpoint character for this.
Yes.
The fact that we're coming with him after the Winter Soldier and the Hydra thing, and a lot of the drama has nothing to do with the Accords, but rather stuff to do with Bucky.
Yes.
It's Captain America's movie. But Iron Man is the antagonist. The ultimate fight is between Iron Man and Captain America. They're not antagonists like he's the bad guy and Cap's the good guy, but they are the direct rivals in the storytelling. And that their goals and their missions are the things that are directly at odds. Zemo is a manipulator at large. Thunderbolt Ross is a pest. But it is the relationship between Cap and Iron Man that is ultimately the thing at play. Everyone else sort of sides with one or the other, but those are the two beacons of the Avengers. So setting up your antagonist with developing scenes is not deriving interest, or pardon me, it is not taking the movie from being a Captain America movie to being the Avengers. It is just being Captain America, but this movie is about Captain America versus Iron Man.
That is true, but at the same time, I almost feel like you need to come to a decision, because one of my biggest criticisms with this movie was it tried to be a little bit of everything. You tried to bring in Captain America. You tried to bring in Tony Stark. You tried to bring in, heck, every other superhero that you could think of, with the exception of maybe the Incredible Hulk and Thor.
Yeah, Hulk and Thor.
Those are the only two missing.
Yeah.
We'll get into it, but we've even brought in like 10 other people that we've never even seen before.
Well, they were all in Avengers too.
Sure, but
you almost have to, when you have a cast this big, you almost have to decide what direction are you going in. And I feel like one of my biggest criticisms of this movie is they tried to do it all at the same time. So think about it this way. Let's say you recast this as truly Captain America. Only his perspective. So you don't cut scene to where Tony Stark has his MIT moment, because you're not interested in his part of the plot line.
Then you would feel much more betrayed by every choice that he makes in this movie.
which one?
By every choice that Tony Stark does. Because he's a very established character. Like, if it wasn't Iron Man, who has had his own movie series, maybe you could make an argument for it. But at that point, we're just talking about Thunderbolt Ross and his cronies, not its own hero who you are at odds with.
Maybe, but at the same time, when a group of characters have grown so big that to actually cover all their perspectives, you're cutting and cutting and cutting, people who are not familiar with the intricacies get lost in the play.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what happened in this movie. It took me 2 times to understand what was going on.
Right. No, I get that. I mean, the interesting thing with the Marvel movies is you have this big sprawling world where you can set up a lot of characters in a lot of movies and have them show up in each other and with minimal exposition. It is difficult to imagine any other series doing that airport fight where you get all these characters who have differing opinions and different motivations face to face with each other. Now, that said, some of those are just parts of this larger pantheon. Like, we don't get Thor and Hulk, which would have probably changed some of that dynamic. Like, how they relate to each other would have been better set up. Like, we know a little bit about how Vision and Scarlet Witch relate to each other, but not nearly to the degree that we see some of the other characters. We know a little bit about how Hawkeye relates, and he's been in a lot of movies at this point, but he hasn't been the front runner for any of them. And most of the people he's facing aren't people he really knows. We get when they square off, for example, like Black Panther fights Winter Soldier, and like that made sense. Of course, he's going to go for that one, and Falcon is going to get up there and is going to try to deal with one of the other flyers, and that made sense from a tactical standpoint. Actually, it's funny to note that like Iron Man and Captain America both have their black military best friend, and they both come from like the different perspectives. Where Iron Man has a colonel who technically outranks Captain America. He's brass, like he's like higher up in the military. He's not like the top pecking order, but he's up there. And Iron Man is a military contractor. He's already up there too. Captain America's out in the field, and his buddy is someone who is a pilot, not literally a pilot, but someone who run like air missions and stuff like that. Like they're soldiers that are out versus the people who are like actually like manipulating and controlling the field. I don't mean like.
Which made it a very interesting philosophical fight from that standpoint. But what I was actually, well, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but if we're gonna go to that fight, let's go to that fight. It made me wonder because it was a great action sequence. But sort of Vision doesn't even play a part in that fight until the second half.
No, he really doesn't want to be.
Is he standing on the sidelines, just like watching, or is he truly involved in this thing?
Yeah, it's curious. I mean, Vision is so powerful. that he, so I had made this joke before on CPOV that throughout that fight, Scarlet Witch kind of just shows up and saves everyone's asses, like, periodically. It's like, oh, I'm about to get punched. Oh, Scarlet Witch saved me. Oh, a building's about to fall on me. Scarlet Witch saves me. And Vision could have been that on the other side. Like, they're the two most powerful players in this
By
fight.
far. Not
yeah.
even close. I mean, he's got, what is it, that energy crystal?
He has one of the Infinity Stones.
Yes.
Like, he has one of the things that... He has the stone that is the MacGuffin of the first two Avengers movies. And that they're making a whole movie about having the 5 of them and that being enough to control the world.
Yes. And he's got one of them.
Yeah.
But he's sort of just sitting on the sideline, and the only time he really takes action, what does he do? He paralyzes one.
Yeah.
Because he misses.
Yeah. It was a good fight. Like, the action scenes were great.
No,
I love Spider-Man in that fight.
No.
I thought Spider-Man made no sense being there, but the actual use of him in it was great.
The fights themselves, I actually thought, and again, you go to see these movies for the action sequences. The action sequences were really, really good. And the special effects, they spent their money very, very well. And personally, I hated the introduction of Ant-Man into this movie, but the way they actually used him was pretty cool.
Yeah, well, and he also had his own movie. Like, the thing was, that would make this more of an Avengers movie, where a guy from a movie who has never interacted with the others shows up to be an active participant. Like,
Sure.
Up until this point, everyone else, aside from Black Panther, who has not had his own movie yet, has been established in the other Avenger movies. If you had seen Avengers 2, theoretically, you know who everyone is.
Right.
Except for Ant-Man. Ant-Man just kind of shows up. I thought he was used well. I noticed a detail. So when they're at the raft, he calls out how Hank Pym said, never trust a Stark. And that scene I caught before. But I noticed earlier, before the fight happens, it's like, Stark's here, and he's like, Stark, and then they move on to the next scene. But I was like, oh, I actually forgot about that part, or didn't notice that he reacted even before the fight, that he had been told and warned countless times that Starks are not to be trusted. So he was going into that fight with that knowledge. It wasn't just after the fight, I'm going to taunt this guy.
So I've actually, again, I missed Ant-Man.
How dare you?
Yes, I know. Yeah. I think it's on, what was it, 99 Cents a Giant last time I was there this morning? Anyways.
Oh, it's pretty good. It's not the best Marvel movie ever, but it's pretty good. It's worth checking out for fun. It is a big city-destroying fight, but it's actually all like a little Lego playset.
Maybe after.
It's actually really funny for that reason.
Maybe after here's the podcast and we can cue that one up next. But in any case, what brings me to is that one of my big pet peeves of this movie, and the thing that made me really upset is, I'm alright with the way that movies are changing these days, is that you place products into the movie. Like, for example, in this movie, I thought that they did it very subtly and well, except for the end scene, is the Audi car placement in almost every single car chase scene. I mean, that's just the way it's going these days. You want to make commercials without seeming like they're commercials, so you place products.
It's like The Truman Show.
Yeah, except now we're living it. But I'm alright with that. But there's a subtlety to, alright, so I'm plugging Audi so the cars are all Audi. I mean, that's been going on for a while, and now it's just more prominent than it was before. Rolex watches, whatever you want to case it. But there's something to be said about, we found a little golden goose, which is these superhero movies have tapped into something in the public at large where everybody wants to see them. Every one of them, with few exceptions, have made a lot of money.
Yeah, and now because they're all so interconnected, it means you really can't miss them, or else you feel like you missed something big. Like, who is this Ant-Man guy? What does he do? Why is it Paul Rudd? That's a weird choice for a superhero.
Right, and so now all of a sudden, you're in the middle of a movie where there's a division between your superhero team, and both sides look at each other at the same time, decide, wait, we need more people. Let's pick up another superhero randomly.
Yeah, or another couple.
So now let's take who is apparently in Europe, and he's got 36 hours to rein in Captain America. So what does he do? The right move, is to go to Bronx and pick up what? 14
Queens. He flies to Queens.
Whatever. Details.
Yeah, no, he picks up Spider-Man, and it's dumb. I don't understand. The geography in general is a lot of weird choices in this movie. Like, they are things that are happening simultaneously, and then all of a sudden people go from one country to being there, and it's not a big deal. Like, when that UN bombing happens, they leave from London, they get there, they're still putting out the fire, and it's like the bombing just happened.
Right.
And, like, Captain America's all of a sudden there.
Right. With
Like,
his entire team.
Yeah, when they, after that fight, or the big airport fight, they're all taken to prison and like set up in prison. And Iron Man shows up, and like all these big trips that they do that should take hours seem to take minutes. It's like if you're just driving around the same city.
Well, the biggest temporal argument that I would make is in the big scene where it's Civil War, where they're all fighting each other. Finally, at the very end, Black Widow lets them get away in the plane. Somehow, Tony Stark has the time to take a conventional helicopter, some secret prison fortress, which I can only assume is North Atlantic, but who knows? Maybe it's Arctic, Antarctica.
Maybe it's like the Black Sea. Maybe that's actually on the way.
Let's hope so, because he's taken a conventional helicopter to some sort of secret ice prison where they've already processed the prisoners and gotten them into cells and restrained them, interrogates them, manages to get into his suit, and somehow makes it to northern Russia in a Iron Man suit that couldn't catch up with the plane in the first place when it was getting away from him.
Yeah, it's pretty weird.
That's an error.
It's a little weird. Yeah, well, I think that's my biggest grievance, like the travel time for everything, and just the circumstances for how they can be everywhere at once just never made sense to me. Like, they want to do this global story, but it seems to be really more set around, like, if this was written around being in Manhattan.
Yes.
Like if this was a classic Marvel Comics superhero story, and they wanted it to be like New York region, and then they were like, we should make it international. That makes more sense. And so all the travel time is like, oh, well, I guess if we take the tunnel, it'll only take 30 minutes. It's like, well, I guess if we fly to space and down, it'll only take 30 minutes.
There is, I mean, you sort of give a little bit of leeway, but at the same time, it's just a sloppy error to have Captain America Winter Soldier arrive when Captain America is done interrogating the prisoners, finding out their location, getting into his suit, flying away, and somehow arrives 30 seconds after they arrive. I mean, it's
No, I agree.
above and beyond.
So here's my question for you.
All right.
So how would you fix it?
So it's very simple. Instead of making the UN bombing in Europe, you just make it in the UN building in New York City.
Yeah.
Heck, you're already there then. It makes sense that Spider-Man would even be there.
Yeah, then the airport fight is like Kennedy
Sure.
or LaGuardia. Like, yeah.
And that's a simple, easy fix that's really doesn't change anything. I mean, I don't know how much the European audience really gave them, to make it set in Germany with some German accents. You could have easily had the Russian agent, on Long Island or something.
And then the secret Hydra base could just be up in like Binghamton.
It's funny you chose that at random, and that's where I grew up.
All right, I'll tell you a few things that I would do.
All right.
All right, so my two biggest issues with this movie are Wakanda and Zemo in terms of their explanation and for the role they play in this movie. So the two big tweaks I would make is I would make Wakanda way more bellicose.
Okay.
Like, when their citizens are killed, I would make T'Chaka, instead of like this like super compassionate, diplomatic, like wise king, I would make him actually kind of aggressive. And I would set up that everyone has to listen to Wakanda because they are so scientifically advanced. Like, the idea in the comic book is that this is the most advanced nation on the planet, that they have weapons and resources that no other nation has. And they're super territorial and isolationist. And this is why they haven't really influenced the rest of the world. But if you ever tried to go to war with them, they would wipe you off the map in a second. And if they were trying to remove that policy, and then their citizens got killed, and then they're like, "Oh, hold on, you're superhumans. Shut this shit down. We are done with this. Hold on, you guys are going to listen to us right now because I am the king of Wakanda, and I actually make the rules here." And if the U.S. government was like, "Okay, we understand," and every other government was like, "Okay, we understand. Yeah, all right, Captain America, you're not allowed to do this anymore." That creates a much more a dynamic introduction for the nation. It was referenced in Avengers 2 They go to like the outskirts of it in Avengers 2, but we don't really see much of it.
No.
And if we set them up as that, and maybe have T'Challa, the Black Panther, be a little bit more compassionate and have him talk to his father, being like, we don't need to be so aggressive. Like, these people are smart and they're just trying to do what's best. They don't know, like what some of the dangers of their powers are. Then you can set him up as actually being that more compassionate voice in contrast. And then his father's death pushes him onto the path of his father in this more like bellicose nature. And then he finds redemption at the end and like returns to his true like balanced self.
And I can see that. I think that if you take the initial scene where they are in Africa, they create a scene, they destroy building Marketplace, there's a lot of casualties, and you, instead of cutting onwards towards some sort of accord, you actually have a scene in the fake country of, what do you call it?
Wakanda.
Yeah, whatever. And you have that scene between father and son where they actually debate this issue. And they come up with, we need to restrict these crazy agents of chaos, also known as the Avengers.
Right.
And then they bring in Tony Stark.
Right, and this is why I felt Tony Stark being at a meeting with T'Chaka would help set up T'Chaka's role. It's not just setting up Tony Stark's role.
Right.
It sets up, this is the role that the Black Panther and that Wakanda plays in this world.
And you add to that the fact that you have this meeting between father and son, and you show up scenes of an advanced nation. You've got, maybe you start off with a very Serenity scene, very clean Marketplace, move on into them turning their focus to their war machine, which outstrips anybody else, and looks very intimidating. That it sort of creates a scene of a society that not only has a lot of order and values that, but also is powerful, and people need to listen.
And they could have genetically enhanced soldiers, which is not quite what they have in the comics, but they could establish that the serums that they have that are kind of similar to the super soldier serum, that's where Black Panther gets his abilities. They could establish that as being a thing that they have, and that's why Black Panther is so goddamn impressive. If you just sort of establish that this is a eugenically amazing super race kind of nation, then when Black Panther shows up, you're like, oh, this is not just one of the plebs who are all super soldiers. This is the crown prince. Right. He is now the king of this nation. He is someone who has clearly been bred to be the best of the best.
Right.
And that's why he can just take down the Winter Soldier, who he just saw take down an army.
Which would definitely eliminate one of my criticisms of the movie, is that you see this, you're introduced to this random leader who is, as far as I knew, head of the UN, leading a resolution. You have we'll get into the issues of the bombing if you want to. You get the bombing, and then all of a sudden you see his son saying, oh, I'll take care of this. For me, does that mean you hire some special ops group? What do you do from there?
He
And
says
all of a
he'll
sudden
kill
you
him
see
himself,
in a suit with no backstory, clawing his way and beating up both Winter Soldier and Captain America, which
shouldn't be possible. We've seen, that's really difficult.
Should not be possible, and yet he does. But there's no backstory to that, and there isn't a backstory until I don't even think the final scene really covers it.
No, they never really explain. They definitely don't explain how he's capable of so much stuff. They mentioned that his armor is vibranium, which at least explains how he's so durable, and gives him a few abilities, but that's it. It's not that much. Now, my other thing that I would shift is I would make Zemo's plan a little more on the forefront. It feels like he kind of gets lucky for a few circumstances, and that's it. When he's torturing that Hydra guy, he says oh, I have another plan. It's gonna be a lot bloodier. What was his other plan? If the guy had just given him all the information, what was Plan A? Because we're seeing Plan B in this movie. What is that Plan A? I would have loved if maybe we introduced the Winter Soldier killed the Starks thing earlier. If the reason why Iron Man and Cap are at such odds and Iron Man is so down to take this guy out is that he found out earlier on that the Winter Soldier is the one who killed his parents. And it's not just like push him into a fight at the end, but that's why he's not like the one who's personally really after the Winter Soldier. Then this is a thing that Zemo does. Like Zemo reveals this detail, and that pushes Cap and Iron Man to like go into this rift. But like they have that airport fight with basically no machinations from Zemo aside from, well, let's get Bucky, let's blame Bucky for a bombing, which is a really minor plan.
And I'd like to say that that is really a stretch. I mean, here you have Zemo who has access to, at the very least, an EMP device.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, you know, when I set up my UN prison, I won't have a backup generator. I mean, I've got these crazy superheroes in lockdown, but I'm going to rely on the power grid. And then, of course, since we have super suits, we have Iron Man, we have Vision. I mean, surely a little trench coat and a wig is gonna make people believe that the Winter Soldier did the bombing, because that's all it really takes.
Like it was basically just like a cutout of his face on a stick that he walked by. It's like it's the Winter Soldier, it's Bucky Barnes. Like that's what I'm saying. If he had revealed that information, like if he had found in Shield's files that it was the Winter Soldier who killed Howard Stark, or if he had found just in that one dude's files,
No, but
like the motivation for Tony Stark to be at such odds with Steve Rogers is not part of Zemo's plan.
No.
And so it doesn't make sense that Zemo's like, oh, I'm pulling the strings. He's not the master manipulator in this scenario. He just happens to be able to push a few things to make it go the best case scenario for him. But even then, how does he know that he's going to be in that position? How does he know that they're going to arrive when they do, or with the people that they do? He never does enough motions to really get the pieces in play that he wants, or that he ultimately needs. It's entirely luck. And it's like I said, that Dark Knight Joker, like, oh, it's all part of my master plan, but with so many more pieces. Like, Joker at least only had to deal with Batman and a couple cops. Like, we're talking about people, like, how does he know that Thor's not going to be there?
Yeah, right.
Like, like, the God of Thunder could just show up and ask Odin, like, did this guy do it? Oh, let me send a Raven. Oh, the Raven came back. He said, no, he actually didn't do it. It's actually someone else. Oh, okay. The gods say no?
Right, it seemed like a little bit of a scramble act. Somebody whose mission it is to divide the Avengers, has spent all this time studying the Avengers, and
read through all S.H.I.E.L.D.'s files. There's got to be a lot more useful information in there than just like, oh, this one...
Which, getting to that, you're telling me that the entire plot rests on the fact that the Winter Soldier killed Tony Stark's parents. He was ordered to do so by Hydra / this ex-Soviet Union and Vladimir Putin. And as this happened, somebody at this random location that the Winter Soldier himself chose put up a video camera.
Yeah.
And the only copy is in Zemo's hands.
Like, that's the thing. We don't know what Zemo had before. We don't know what Zemo actually got at this place. Like, how did he know that video file was going to be there? Was it in the S.H.I.E.L.D. files? Was it in the dude's files? Was it in the Hydra stuff? Like, we don't know. And so it doesn't feel like Zemo actually knew what he was using, like what tools he was using to break the Avengers apart.
But there is an easy fix for that, which I think is the point of what we're doing, and that is the Winter Soldier gets ordered to execute Tony Stark, his father and mother, but not just told in that beginning scene when they bring him out of hibernation. He's told to execute them at a specific location. That's all you have to do, is you have to say, you will kill so-and-so. And you don't have to say it exactly, but you have to say, you have to bring in that forestory as he has to do this mission at such and such location. Because they want to use that maybe ahead of time. But even then, even if you did that, the issue becomes are these people playing chess and they're 10 moves ahead? Then how did they ever fall as Hydra?
Yeah, it's really weird that we got...
It's a stretch.
Some of the points that we got. Like, I was okay with the fake out about the other super soldiers. the blue
like
liquid.
that.
That was
I like
nice.
that.
I thought that was an okay MacGuffin to get people into position, but I just don't think that the tools that he had outside of that, like that was a good like bait, but he didn't do anything really with that bait. And he, because let's say he didn't have that video in the movie that we actually watched.
Right.
Like if he didn't have that video and Cap and Iron Man just arrest him, well, the Avengers are still kind of fucked. Like a lot of people just went to jail. Cap is still split, or like Cap presumably is going to be arrested by Ross or go into hiding. Pretty much everything plays out the same way, except he and Iron Man aren't at such odds, and they kind of aren't at the end anyway. Like that letter, it indicates that Cap definitely doesn't hold a grudge against Iron Man, and that Iron Man, it looks like, doesn't hold the same grudge against Cap. So really, that fight didn't do anything.
That's true.
The only thing it did was it sort of confirmed that, like, oh, Winter Soldier did some fucked up shit. Cap, you can't necessarily rely on this guy, which we already knew, and like he knew, and Bucky knew. Like that fight doesn't do anything. Yeah. So if that motivation that he killed my mom, which was a great line and a great point, because this has been driving Stark since the first movie. Like was this raging alcoholic in part because of his dad's death and his like issues with his parents. And that's been the benefit of this long Marvel project. That should have been the motivation more in the movie and not just in that last fight, because it doesn't do anything once he cools off.
Which makes me think that the movie started off great, and then it sort of faded.
Yeah. I think the Russo brothers are really good directors. I think the fights work really well. They do some great things in that. Like the Winter Soldier's escape when we first like cut back to him from that SWAT team.
Yes.
Like that's like a reverse raid that sets up, oh, this is how badass he is. And then we get into the real fight when Black Panther shows up and we're like, oh no, this is the real fight. And Black Panther is so much better. Like we established all these things, like every fight does tell us something about the people involved.
But there's no background to it. Like you don't understand. I mean, yes, I understand the reverse raid was actually really a great.
What I'm saying is that the screenplay has a lot of scenes that had to happen that don't necessarily have the stitching to make it work as well.
Because maybe they don't go into the background well enough. Maybe they're trying to present so many viewpoints that they never finish any of them, which is my bigger point in this movie. That being said, that raid had a really, really good scene that I like where Captain America gets tired of chasing Bucky, so he just sort of like gets into the SUV and starts driving.
Oh, yeah. They make a reference in Winter Soldier too. I think that's an allusion to the 1990 Captain America movie where he just keeps on stealing cars from people. It's a really bad movie. It's J.D. Salinger's son plays Captain America in it. It's so weird. It's a movie where like basically Captain America is the sidekick to the President of the United States of America. Like who is the real hero? He's like the one who ultimately beats the Red Skull and all this other weird stuff. But he just keeps stealing cars. Like he's like, oh, I'm starting to feel woozy, and then it's like runs and grabs someone's car and drives off. So they make an allusion in Winter Soldier where it's like, where did Captain America learn to steal a car? And this one's like, well, we need to solve a problem. Stealing a car.
Stealing a car.
It's just a weird detail for him.
It was. I actually really enjoyed that scene. I also enjoyed, speaking of car scenes, where he has that, Captain America has a little moment with the, who's the blonde chick?
Sharon Carter.
Okay. But it was a little bit of a cheesy scene. But I actually like the dynamic between Winter Soldier, Captain America,
and Falcon.
And Falcon.
Well, they have a wonderful relationship because in like the big theme for Winter Soldier was like friendship and brotherhood.
Yes.
And like Winter Soldier represents Captain America's like foundational one, his old school buddy, and Falcon is his new school buddy. And like their rapport with each other, it's like they're both threatening each other's turf.
Right.
And that's what I love about those two. That dynamic and then the Peter Parker, Tony Stark dynamic are such great relationships.
They are good relationships, and I think that and I understand like, they're trying to make it into all-encompassing. The way that I would have made this movie better would have made what I think of now, having seen it twice, is a good movie better, is if instead of trying to bring in everybody, they just focused on those relationships. Like, you didn't need to bring in all these other heroes. You really didn't. Like, do you really need to bring in Vision? Like, do you have to?
But and here's me playing the studio advocate here. This was their chance to do that movie where you had the big superhero fight, because you have to have established a lot of superheroes before you can have a big superhero fight. And this was the first time they thought they could do it. Now, then the movie that was chosen to tell was a more character-driven piece. And maybe it should have been Avengers Civil War if they wanted to do this big fight, but they did Captain America Civil War. So it's about Captain America and his relationship with Bucky and his relationship with Iron Man. And that's the driving force of this movie.
But I don't think that in a movie which has so little time, you can have it both ways. You can't have a movie where you explore all these pretty complicated relationships when you think about it. Like, what you're talking about is relationships which go back multiple movies, potentially even drift into comic books for the diehard fans. And at the same time, you're trying to bring in all these characters to have a huge battle. I'm actually comfortable with either one of those. Like, you could explore the complicated relationships between Tony Stark and his parents, at the same time realizing Winter Soldier killed his parents and Captain America is protecting Winter Soldier because he's his friend, and he's kind of torn because Winter Soldier was just under orders, didn't really realize what he was doing. That's a movie. But you bring in that and a huge battle scene between every single Avenger and superhero, with the exception of a few like Thor and others, you start creating what I think of as a movie that could have been great into a movie that could be improved. I think you can have either,
But not both.
but not both the same.
Yeah.
Not in the timeline you're talking about. Maybe in like a Lord of the Rings extended edition style, but
So this was a one-off movie. This could have been a little bit better as it was written, without even really sacrificing all the things that they put into it. If they kind of up the power of action of the villain and also established one of the big players, which is the Black Panther, a little bit better. Now, you could have done a lot of like big superhero stuff and made it even bigger, or you could have pared it down a little bit more and really focused on your characters. But I think either way, it was a well-regarded movie. I think there's some really funny scenes in it. You walk out of it, you're like, those action scenes were good. There's good dialogue. It was a charming movie. Worst case scenario, it was a good movie, but not great. And you could definitely push it to be even better. And if you made some like even harder decisions, make it great. But one thing I will say that's really good is they didn't just do Civil War the comic, because that's not particularly good. And that relies on comics being around for 40 years and not just 8 years of Iron Man movies.
that's fair. And I think that I felt good walking out of it the first time. I felt good walking out of it, even better walking out of it the second time. And I think part of that is you walk into these movies with a certain expectation. Certainly they met that expectation. They plugged a lot more of their movies, power to them. We certainly can make this a little bit better, and I think if you had either focused on either more plot or more action, you would have had a better movie.
Yeah.
You can't have both at the same time, not with this many characters. And case in point, the only thing that I'm going to say is, you come at it with a viewpoint of, I have read all the comics and I am intimately familiar with all the movies. I come at it with a viewpoint of, I'm familiar with most of the movies, I've read none of the comics. But somebody who's coming off who's only seen one or two movies and watches this?
I mean, to understand this movie, there's really 4 movies you need to have seen, which is Cap 1 and 2 and Avengers 1 and 2. Otherwise, you're not going to understand anything.
But I feel that if they had not tried to pack all this into one movie and made it into 2 movies, or focus on either all action or all plot, you could have actually had everybody happy. I really think so.
That's an interesting thing to ponder. But on that note, I think we've sort of talked about this movie to death. Tom, it was great having you on. Thanks again.
Absolutely.
All right, fans, thanks for tuning in. And next time we'll be talking about Highlander 2. And until then, stay scruffy, my nerf herders.
Thanks for listening to Certain Point of View's Another Pass podcast. Don't miss an episode. Just subscribe and review the show on iTunes. Just go to certainpov.com/podcast. ITunes.com.
How political is this podcast?
I have not addressed the fact that I'm a big old libtard, but publicly. But
I mean, Trump has made some statements. Maybe we could show him this movie. Maybe he could take some pointers from that scene.
saw a great movie last night. Great ideas. It's gonna be huge.
Hashtag, we're going to get all the information from the prisoners. All right.